Uh, Welcome, everyone. This is our final meetup on Faust. We're going to do an overview of part one and part two, the entire work. And I have quite a few notes I made along the way. So I hope this is going to be informative, exciting. And of course, I am very interested in what you have to say as well. So I will make a couple of comments of my own, and then I will open it up to everyone else who has read the book, the work, and we'll go from there.
Bill, can I say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
So after all of this is done, I'm going to ask you a question about what do you think is the deepest philosophical question that Faust raises, and what are your thoughts on that? So that's going to be the final question for everybody. Go ahead, Phil.
All right, so I want to start this conversation, the overview conversation, by citing one of the early notes that Goethe made when he was developing Faust, kind of the inception of the idea. And this is kind of an amazing thing. We have his notes, we have his extensive correspondence with Schiller and with Eckermann. We know what he wanted the work to be. So this is an amazing opportunity to look into the writer's own understanding and essentially get an insight of what he was trying to do. So one of his early drafts has the following notes in it. Is just, and these are just like outlines, right? Just the notes that he made, jotted down some ideas. And one of the first ones, it says, conflict between form and formless, as a kind of a bullet point. Conflict between form and formless. Preference for formless content over empty form. Now, I wish I had read this actually before we started this, because this idea is so interesting. And when you start looking at it and then bringing it into kind of everything else, all the protagonists and all the action that's going on, it starts to make a lot of sense. So I started looking at what we've read from that lens alone, the form and the conflict of the form and the content. Just before the meetup started, Doug and I were talking about how when you read Faust, there's so much going on that it's somewhat chaotic. It gives you this vertigo because of so much information and so many different contexts that you're plunged in. But this is by design. And this idea that Goethe wanted to portray this conflict, this tension between the perfect, the form, the ideal, and the actual, the form, what he calls the formless content, and also the fact that he actually prefers the formless content to the ideal. And we've seen this over and over and over again. So I want to just point out a couple of examples of that. So we have two female protagonists, Gretchen or Margaret and Helen. Well, Gretchen is obviously not an ideal woman. She is a woman that Faust is strongly attracted to, and they have this romance, this tragic romance. But obviously, she is not, in his mind at least, not the ideal woman. The ideal is Helen. So he goes after Helen. But in reality, when we finish the work, it is Gretchen who is the savior, the redeemer of Faust. She redeems this whole journey, essentially. Then not Helen. Helen is out of the picture. So Gretchen, to me, is the perfect example of this triumph of formless content over ideal, over the form. Another example, homunculus. Homunculus starts out as this idealized being, right? A man born in a retort, but who lacks an actual existence. He lacks materiality. He lacks physical contact with his surroundings. And what does he do? He crashes himself into the side of Galatea's chariot and plunges himself into the ocean, this kind of primeval cauldron of life, of activity, and presumably perishes. We don't know that, but the implication is he dies. He perishes in this attempt to experience life in its fullest, thus giving, again, underscoring this preference for formless content over the form. Of course, in a sort of Hegelian way, right, form cannot exist without content, and content always produces some form. But in Goethe's mind, if there is a separation of these two ideas, which it's not clear that there is, but if there is a separation, if they're separate, then he gives preference to the formless content. Translation of John 1 in the very beginning, in part 1, where Faust translates John 1, in the beginning was the word, he goes to say, no, in the beginning was not the word, logos, right? He's not, logos is the ideal, logos is something, a perfect form, right, without content in a way. He says, no, I think in the beginning was the deed. So action, right? Action, even that's not fully delineated, is preferable to him. He's a man of action. He's a man of pursuits. He wants the stars from highest heaven, the lust from deepest earth. That's his motto. That's his modus operandi. Another one, Faust versus Wagner in the beginning. Faust is all action, Wagner is all theory. So that one is almost too good of a juxtaposition, right? Faust is all about action, restless action, not imperfect action, perhaps misdirected action, somewhat chaotic action. I mean, it's all about trying. It's all about striving. And of course, that's where we start out. If you remember the first scene in heaven, in the prologue, God says, man errs as long as he strives. But the implication is that as long as he keeps striving, that degree of error is hopefully decreasing. And he's becoming this perfect tree that is being grown by the master gardener. So then we have finally in the end, when we have the scene where we have different church fathers and anchorites singing praises to God, there is this curious addition of the blessed boys. These are infants who have died before they were baptized, but before they have sinned. So they're kind of innocent, and yet they have not experienced anything. And they're described as pupa. They're undeveloped yet. They're like, you know, they're the embryo, but without actual manifestation. And they're aching to experience the world. So they are, again, the form without the substance. They're kind of like homunculus in a way. And they aspire to reach this new understanding of divinity, of this new environment that they're in. And they're somewhat, I guess, jealous, perhaps, well, not jealous, that's probably not the right word, but they are aspiring to reach to this new level of existence. And so they also constitute this example of form versus, let's say, angels who have both being, form, experience, memory. So they are, in that sense, above these blessed boys, the innocence that they possess, but not actual experience, not actual knowledge. So anyway, this idea I thought was very deep and interesting, and it kind of runs through the entire work. Maybe that's something that we can tie back to Shrikant's question about deep philosophical currents that run through Faust. I think this is definitely one of them, and according to Goethe, it is one of them. Okay, so that's a lot right there, I think, to think about. The next thing I wanted to go over or present, and I'm very curious about Madeline's feedback on this, because she mentioned that, I think in the previous meetup we had, was this idea of how Goethe composed the work to align what's happening in part 1 with what's happening in part 2. So what I did is I put together a possible alignment that at least makes sense to me. Now, I'm not sure this, I didn't take it from some critical work or from some interpretive notes. I put it together as I see it. So I don't know if anybody has kind of the authoritative version, the scholarly version, if you will. I would be curious to see if my amateur reading of this differs from the scholarly version. At least that's just what, kind of the way I saw it. So let me see if I can share my screen real quick. I want to show this to you and just maybe go through a couple of high points and see if you find this interesting or compelling. I thought once I started doing this, I thought this was very, very interesting work. So thank you, Madeline, for putting that idea forward, I guess reminding us to cover this. So here we go. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. Can you guys see this?
It's coming up. Yep. The text is a little too small, though.
A little small? Okay,
Yeah.
let me make it bigger. Let me make it bigger. I guess I'm gonna have to exit the full screen. Okay, how about now?
Yeah, that's much better. That's perfect.
Okay, all right, so let's do it like this. All right, so we have the first three parts: the dedication, prelude in theater, and prologue in heaven. It's not really part of part one. It's really more applicable to the entire work. And then after the prologue in heaven, we get into the actual meat of the play. And what I started to do is to kind of color code things that are corresponding to each other. So we start out with night study outside the city gate. We meet Faust as he is in his study. He is restless, he is depressed, he is thinking of committing suicide. He's tried everything, nothing seems to give him satisfaction. And then he is revived by the sound of Easter church service bells. In Act 1 of Part 2, Faust is not in his study, he is sleeping. He is put in the sleep, kind of like in a coma, basically, but he is very restless. He is guilty now. He has essentially led to the demise, his actions led to the demise of Gretchen and her family. So he has this guilty conscience that he needs to, that is weighing down on him. And he is revived by this Ariel figure. And also there's the rising of the sun. So nature comes to play. And I think there's some parallelism that we can draw from these two scenes, at least in my mind. The second thing that we see is Faust again is in his study, and this is when he meets Mephistopheles. This is when they make the pact. This is when he is trying initially to use alchemy to conjure up the earth spirit, and then he's trying to draw the sign of macrocosm and all of that. In Act 2 of Part 2, we again come back to Faust's study. So we physically return to the same place where we started. If you remember, Mephistopheles meets a student who became a Bachelor of Arts or Sciences, has this interesting discussion with him, and then we meet with Wagner, who is creating homunculus in a retort. So there's definitely some parallelism there, because we actually are coming back to the same place in Part 2. Moving forward, I think this is where I'm not as sure, but I think there's some parallelism with Auerbach's Tavern and Witch's Kitchen and the Imperial Residence, Imperial Residence, if you remember, this is where we meet the Emperor. And this is where Mephistopheles comes up with this grand plan of issuing paper money, basically money out of nothing that is backed by riches that are to be found in the ground, right? The abandoned treasures in the ground, supposedly, that are just waiting to be unearthed. So all this wealth and paper money sort of reminds me of the trick that Mephistopheles performs in Auerbach's Tavern, where he, if you remember, produces wine, and then they see vineyards and grapes, and it's all wonderful until it all disappears just as fast as it appeared. The same way, of course, that we see the demise of this inflationary monetary emission. So I think there's some parallels there. Moving on, we meet Gretchen in part 1, and we see we meet Martha. We meet some of Gretchen's friends, and we end up on a street. In part 2, there are lots of different connecting elements. So one of them, I think, is the carnival, where we see this pageant of various cross sections of German society or society of that empire that is presented to us, together with some abstractions of that society, such as hopes, fears, desires. If you remember, they're also part of the pageant. They come up to us. Then, of course, we have Plutus, wealth, riding the elephant. So that's another parallel with this kind of context in which we meet Gretchen. The love affair between Faust and Gretchen in first part is clearly parallelized or can be juxtaposed with Faust's quest for Helen. I mean, that one is a pretty clear parallel, so I don't think there's much to be said there. In part 1, Faust is infatuated with Gretchen. In part 2, he's infatuated with Helen. Both end up as not really bringing him any satisfaction. And then we have this interesting kind of an interlude scene, Faust in the forest, where he's meditating on nature. This scene is actually also paralleled in Act 4, I think, where he's in the high mountains just before they approach the emperor and on another quest. There's the scene where they discuss how mountains are formed, and how Faust is getting all excited about nature and the power of nature, and how the evolution, and the devil tells him that no, it's just it's just some artificial movement from hell that's causing all of this commotion. But Faust says no, it's got to be nature. It's got to be this sort of romantic ideal of nature moving and evolving and being a living thing. So there's some parallels there, possibly. The section on the murder of Valentine, Gretchen's brother, in my mind, it very closely mimics or mirrors one of the last scenes, which is the murder of Baucis and Philemon. Of course, Baucis and Philemon are just these pastoral figures that live on the seaside, and Faust just can't stand the fact that they're interfering with his program of forced progress, and so he wants them off the land. He commissions Mephistopheles to perform this, and of course, knowing Mephistopheles, they all end up dead. So that's I think that's a pretty clear parallel there. Of course, the most obvious one is the Walpurgis Night. So we have Walpurgis Night in part 1. We have something very similar in part 2, Act 3, where we travel to ancient Greece, and we basically have this procession of all the different mythical creatures, including some of the Furies and the Sphinx and the ants, and just everything under the sun you can think of that's part of Greek pantheon. So this one is I'm pretty confident in this parallel. And then I guess the ending is also somewhat reminiscent of the beginning, where we end up in the dungeon in part 1, and then we end up in the scene that we end up where Faust dies is, of course, a place where he's also redeemed and saved. His soul, his eternal soul, is borne up by the angels in the end, just like Gretchen's soul is saved with a cry from heaven that she is redeemed. So there's some clear parallels there. And of course, the last part the last part is the epilogue, where we have adoration, not from angels this time, but from all of these different saints, including the blessed boys, church fathers, angels. I mean, it's kind of this universal praise to God scene, very similar to what we see in Dante in Paradiso and Canto 33. So anyway, this was my way of creating this kind of a parallel landscape. I know I've said a lot so far, so I'm going to stop and maybe give a chance to get some feedback, both from this and also any ideas that you thought were interesting and you want to tie them together with what kind of basically the last part of the reading and also the entire work. So I'll stop here. Shrikant, you want to kind of manage our
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to stop sharing the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Folks, comments, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to comment. We'll start with Doug. Doug, go ahead.
Oh, well, I unmuted. I wasn't sure. I'm totally, well, I'll say a couple of things. I think Phil's charts are amazing. You know, the spreadsheets on Dante and this chart on Faust. I mean, where you you really map sort of the possible structures and echoes. And as I was jumping around some things, the end of part 1 and the end of part 2 have these strange echoes where they're trying to save Margaret Gretchen, and she doesn't want to be saved. And in fact, she's terrified of Mephistopheles and that she might be saved, which means she'll lose her soul. And she goes a different direction. And then Henry's name is called out, most likely by Gretchen, and that sort of echoes things at the end of 2. But I think these charts, when you look at them, they're really fascinating. And the only thing I really wanted to say right now, and probably will say more later, is I went back to the George Santayana's essay on 3 philosophical poets, which is Lucretius and Dante and Goethe. And it's Goethe specifically as he's represented in Faust. So it's a really interesting review of Faust, but also kind of an interesting review of Dante. And I haven't read the whole book, but starting with the Faust, it's actually kind of a good review of Santayana's own book and theories about why Lucretius and Dante are philosophers and Goethe may not be a philosopher. And because maybe it's this commitment to the formless form, which is an echo of the Buddhist Heart Sutra of emptiness is form, form is emptiness, which is one of the most important Buddhist sutras, is about form and emptiness and how they're interconnected. So those are kind of echoing things that Phil talked about that I think this chart, I'd love to have a copy to study it myself.
I just posted in chat.
Yeah, I just saw it that you posted it. The only other thing, let me see if I can find one of these quotes from Santayana. He says, "Now Faust is the foam on the top of 2 great waves of human aspiration, merging and heaping themselves up together. The wave of romanticism rising from the depths of Northern traditions and genius, and the wave of new paganism coming from Greece over Italy, And so there are these 2 waves, and Faust is, many things have talked about how Faust is trying to fuse romanticism and classicism and, the reason versus, and the emotions and the romanticism. And again, when you repeated the thing about in the beginning was the word and the beginning was the deed, that echoes things I talked about the action and the verb and the Greeks feeling that action, the tragedy is a movement, is an imitation of an action and a kind of movement of spirit from inside to outside, usually for the Greeks, but often from outside to inside. So Goethe has definitely really tracked the history of thought and action, and but he's but also the thing Santayana says is that it kind of made me feel a little more comfortable based on my confusion of trying to understand Faust, that he's piling up actions and imagery and storms to really confuse the rational mind, to really kind of like blow it apart. And I think that, and when I look at the overview, I go, yeah, Goethe's really doing that. He's trying to explode your expectation that you're going to be able to figure it out. And that you may be able to figure it out, but it will be with a different part of your being, where the mind and body and everything kind of is tackling the problem. So I'll leave it at that for now and see what others have to say about that. But that,
Thank
I
you.
think you summarized that really brilliantly, Phil, that, you know, this formless emptiness, this empty content.
Well, I'm just repeating what Goethe said, so.
Yeah, no, I know, but it's,
Yeah.
but you pulled it out of the
Yes,
pile, the mountain of stuff he said, and you pulled it out, and it's like, it's a good, what do they call it? A touchstone for saying, okay, here's the path, and the path is confusing. And it's meant to be.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Yulia, Joe, and Allison. Yulia.
Hi. So I just read this play alone, and I was very, very confused. And so I just have a number of questions. I had read Marlowe's before, which was like, you know, a breeze in comparison. It's very, very clear that Faustus' desire for knowledge is meant to be evil. But in Goethe, it's more confusing, and I'm not even really sure what Faust's initial goal was, because he says in part that he wants knowledge, but then at the same time, he says that he wants to be cured of his thirst for knowledge. That's what I have here in 1767 in my edition. That he's looking for his heart to be cured of its thirst for knowledge. So this seems really contradictory, and I'm not sure if anybody has an idea of whether Goethe has some sort of overarching philosophy with respect to knowledge. And then also the kind of crux of the wager was that he would never say to any moment, Terry, you are so fair, right? And then at the end, where he has actually a moment that he wants to remain in, that's when he supposedly loses the wager. And so I also don't know if Goethe meant that to have some sort of philosophy with respect to time, right? Where it seems like he's trying to maybe say that, you know, the goal is to enter the present moment or something like that. So I just was wondering if anybody could clear any of this up for me.
Excellent questions, Yulia. Thank you. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, these are excellent questions. The first one about Faust's goals. So that's an interesting one. I don't think his goal was just to be cured of thirst for knowledge. I think his goal was to actually experience as much as he can. At least that's his description given to us by Mephistopheles, which I trust more than Faust's own description of himself. Mephistopheles seems to me to be a more pragmatic, objective, if you will, more objective viewer or hero in the play. Faust describes how he's feeling at the moment. So right now, you know, he might be feeling that he's sick of knowledge, but then he wants knowledge. He is sick of further pursuits of power, but then he wants more power. And he's a person who is truly restless and unsatisfied. And I think that's the whole point. I think Goethe wants us to understand that he will never be satisfied. That's human nature. And when we first meet Mephistopheles in heaven with God, they're talking about Faust. And how does Mephistopheles describe him? He describes him as a man who wants the highest stars from heaven, the deepest lusts from earth, who doesn't really know what he wants. That's the point of it. And God says that's fine, because you know what? As long as he's striving, as long as he is attempting to reach the next level, I will guide him to perfection. So that's the bet. The bet is he needs to keep going. And if he finds that at some point he has this complacency moment where he says, I've reached the limit, I am perfect, essentially, that's when he loses that bet. So I don't know that it's necessarily about time as much as the fact that Goethe builds this sort of romantic ideal of a man in progress, maybe, that never stops. The moment it stops is the moment it dies. And that's what happens to Faust. The moment he says, I savor the highest moment, stop moment, you're so fair. That's it. He doesn't want to move on any further. Ironically, he doesn't actually savor the moment as it is. He is savoring a future moment, right? That hasn't actually occurred. He's seeing these people, they're building something on this, the shore of the ocean, they're battling nature, free people in a free land, as Faust calls them. And yet, whatever he describes hasn't actually happened. So he's saying, okay, I'm foretasting it. I'm foretasting, and in the foretaste of this future utopia, which is just about around the corner, I'm tasting the perfect moment so fair, Terry, bam, he's done. So I don't know if that answers any of your questions about that, but I think the whole point is to make it a little bit confusing. Like Doug said, I don't read Faust as knowing what he wants himself, and that's a perfect picture of mankind. We don't know what we want. We don't have, we might think we know, but we don't. And Faust is a perfect example of that, and that's why he's kind of like a bull in a china shop, going through different things, and everything is a kind of a leaving behind him the wake of collateral damage. But yeah, that's the trajectory.
No, that makes total sense then for why I would be confused, is because he himself is confused and has all
right. He's not sure himself.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elia. Great question, and Phil, great answer. Next up is going to be Joe, Allison, and Madeline. Joe.
So there's a question I've been thinking about since Wednesday that you had actually talked about briefly with Faust, is that what are the ethics that are actually being proposed in this work? What is Goethe telling us about ethics in general? And I honestly have come to the conclusion that he's not saying anything about ethics at all. I don't think he really is. I think he's just talking about human striving. This constant quest for knowledge. I mean, because I'm thinking about the whole entire play, and there are ethical decisions being made. Yeah, sure. And but what is he saying about those decisions? And there's nothing clear about that. There's no framework that Faust is using, other than the fact that he's constantly striving for knowledge and understanding of the world. So I want to get people's thoughts on this, because I was thinking about this really wholeheartedly, is that what's the ethical message, if any? And I don't believe there is any after actually thinking about it. I think it's a story about human desire, the desire to actually, to understand the world, and to really and the limits of pleasure within that framework as well. But anyway, I wanted to just throw that question out there to everyone, because I think that would be really interesting to explore.
Excellent. Doug, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Well, he's not saying anything about ethics, but he's dramatizing the problem of ethics. And there is an action that leads the audience to maybe question behaviors and bring up the issue of ethics. And that's the difference between drama and an essay. For example, the first part ends with he loses something he loves, and he's devastated by it. And like what I said, the purpose, passion, perception, the tragic rhythm of he is totally exhausted and ended in a puddle of passion. And he has to begin Act 2 resting and napping to heal himself from this explosion of passion that he can't save Gretchen. And at the end, when the couple is killed, I think that destroys him. He's suddenly an old man after that. He's like this real estate developer trying to claim new land, and it kills two people he really loves. And so the whole action of the piece brings up the issue of ethics, but he never explains it. He never says, oh, this is ethics, this is what it is. But the action makes you think, oh, that's not good. You know, these guys who were just doing what the great, he's in a way the great entrepreneur is saying, clear the fields, and they do, and it kills something he really loves. And so, you know, that those figures who were just, oh, we'll do whatever he says, and they wipe out these people by misunderstanding the order or the spirit of the order or the spirit of the intent, which leads to very destructive actions. That's the chaos of the actions of this play that force the viewer to figure something else out. And all theater is not the same after Goethe. It splits off into Frank Wedekind, Bertolt Brecht, all kinds of different dramatists. Schiller has probably influenced him as well, apparently from something I read that Schiller influenced Goethe. But that idea of what are your actions, what are they doing?
Right.
I want to add to that just a little bit, in that I totally agree with Doug. I think it's not necessary for Goethe to come out and say this is right or this is wrong. It's implied in the action. Now I know that maybe in the American mindset, you have to have everything spelled out, you know, like you know, here's the sentence from the judge. But in reality, when it's dramatized like this, and you begin to empathize with a certain set of characters, and vice versa, you get angry at the actions of people that are against you, that implies a particular ethic. The only thing that makes it a little more complex is what we talked about in the beginning, this idea of triumph of formless content over form, because that implies a certain degree of chaos and a certain degree of disarray. And Faust definitely creates that. And so in that sense, it seems to me that Goethe is implying that a force for a progressive force is good, even though it can create this destruction in its wake. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, or I don't know, maybe you do, maybe, but it seems to be implied in this idea of striving. So, you know, if we're in an equilibrium, there is no striving, nothing is happening, but nobody gets hurt. Is that what we want as a society? I mean, as a macrocosm of society? Maybe not. Maybe Goethe thinks that's a dead end. That's death. One other thing I want to mention that in connection with that is Mephistopheles himself is presented as the spirit of negation. He is the spirit of nothingness. He wants nothing to exist. So that seems to me to be the perfect form, right? An ideal nothing. Perfect evil, if you will, of nothingness. And in that, there's also a certain ethic. So the ethic of destruction, removing life, removing movement, removing any kind of
So chaos?
Sorry?
Would you equate that to chaos?
Chaos is movement, right? That's why it's chaotic. If everything is frozen, you don't have chaos because everything is orderly,
Okay.
in place. But movement creates chaos by nature, right? So as long as there's a striving, as long as there's this movement, the chaos theoretically could end up in some sort of beneficial configuration, if you will. What's beneficial, that's when you get into ethics, right? That's when you get into what's good for us, what's bad for us. So some of these questions are sidestepped, I think, but a general overarching view is that movement is good in general. That's the ethics of progress, right? A movement forward, more technology, more power over nature, more whatever you want to call it. And at the time, it was, you know, Enlightenment. We're on the verge of, if not part of, you know, we're already experiencing Industrial Revolution in England. So all of these things are already happening. And so it's not surprising that Goethe is kind of jumping on the bandwagon and saying, yes, we should be, maybe, I don't know if he's taking a position there, but at least it's presented as if he were. So that's, anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. I agree with Doug and Phil. Basically, art show, it's like show, don't tell. It's like it demonstrates the ethics, it demonstrates the metaphysics, it demonstrates the epistemology. It is there in it without explicitly talking about it. Like the class, if you want a dramatic example, you can take visual arts, David is showing you a view of life, it is showing you a metaphysics, Michelangelo's David, you're showing the, what the view of the world is, what you should do, all of that is there, but nothing is being said explicitly about it. Next up is going to be Allison, Madeline, and Maritza. Allison.
I think for a lot of this book, I felt very frustrated because I wanted to see Faust grow. And by the end, I felt like he never really did. And then I started thinking about how that maybe the reason I wanted him to grow and change is because that's so much a part of American literature and our movies. We tend to always have the happy ending. So you want to see this character arc where maybe they're, behaving badly and then they learn, they grow, and then we get the happy ending. And it never came. And what was kind of interesting is at the same time I was reading this, I was also reading On the Road for another book club of mine. And that's another book where, the main character never actually really grows or changes or learns much of anything. And then I just started thinking that what was interesting is that both books were about these young men having this insatiable need for experience, and without there being growth through it. But what was interesting about On the Road is that he mentions Hemingway and he mentions the Tao Te Ching. And then it got me thinking about another book that I read not long ago called Leave Society by Dao Lin, which is sort of a book of non-action, which also mentions the Tao Te Ching. And then I just started thinking of all of these books together and thinking that really what they are is, that's just what life is. It's like you're on a river going along, having experiences, and maybe there isn't any real meaning to it. And maybe the point of all of these three books is just this sort of, that life doesn't actually have any meaning. That's it. It's sort of like a nihilist thing. I mean, you're just having experiences and then you die. And, we don't always grow. We don't always change. There isn't always a big, and then when you look at kind of like the history of the world, it's like, okay, you go to war and you conquer this country or that. What do we ever really change? Not really. We're not really that, we might develop different tools, different technology, but we're not really that different than we were 3,000 years ago, really. And so sometimes maybe like it's the story we tell to ourselves that we're always on a path of getting better and better and better, but really we're just not. We're just, we're born, we have a whole bunch of experiences and we die, and maybe that's it. And maybe that is the point that all three authors had. That maybe the other novels are the ones that really aren't really reflecting true reality, and these actually are reflecting reality. I don't know.
I can hear Mephistopheles right there behind you.
Well, and it's interesting. I studied with most of the major modern dance companies, except Merce Cunningham. I refused to study with him on purpose because he had this whole idea of that life had no meaning and art had no meaning. It drove me insane. And I remember there was he did one dance where he divided into 4 sections or 8 section, whatever it is on the dice. And then he numbered them and then he rolled the dice. And then he randomly decided which order they would be presented based on the rolling of the dice. And when I was 22 years old, this drove me insane because I wanted life to have meaning. I wanted art to have meaning. I thought there needed to be a purpose. And over the years, as I've gotten older and older, I keep thinking back to that and thinking, my God, Merce Cunningham was right. It is random. Life is so random in terms of what path we come across, all these things. There's such an element of chance and randomness. And lack of meaning in life. And it's a weird thing to admit, but that seems to be the way it goes. I'm not sure I like it, but it is, that's how it goes. I don't know.
Thank you. I'm keeping track of all these philosophical points. So at the end, we will get to discuss all of them together. So next up is going to be Madeline, Maritza, and Paul. Madeline.
Thanks, Shrikant. I'll try to be brief. Phil, that was really fantastic. It was completely amazing. You knocked it out of the park. It was great. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
And both you and Doug have been such able guides through Journey, it's kind of a bewildering play. I was thinking about what Yulia had said. It is confusing, and I was thinking of that in terms of the form and the content, or let's say maybe the content and the container being form. So throughout, Faust's quest is he's yearning for the sublime, and he does get that at the end. And so his content really is yearning, and he feels that he's going to find that in a particular form. So he tries on different forms, basically, in the form of social roles, as an individual in part 1, and as a public figure in part 2. I saw his earthly ending somewhat differently than Doug did. I felt that he did not really love those old people. He would have left them there. He was still greedy, but I'm looking at this paper. It is by David Welberry from the University of Chicago, and it's called Form, and it's on the Goethe Lexicon website at University of Pittsburgh. So I'm looking at this paper, and at the very end, he talks about, this is a translation into English, the beautiful is when we intuit that which is lawfully alive in its immense activity and perfection, through which we are stimulated to reproduce it and simultaneously feel ourselves alive and stirred to highest activity. And I think that sense is what Faust had at the very end when he was directing the activity. And he felt like he was finally sort of right-sized in his proper place in the world. And he'd found beauty, really. And so he was ready to go. Yeah, so that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. That was amazing. Thank you. And let me see here. I really like this quote. So I have to summarize it in some form, and I'll bring it up as a topic in the philosophical themes. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Paul. Maritza.
Hi. So I think that there is an ethical component to this book. It's kind of a confusing play the way it goes. I really thought that the second part of the story was going to be a lot less bumbling and just erroneous making than it was. I see what Allison is saying in that he doesn't show much growth. I mean, he does though. I see him. It does make one wonder, like, really, is this the bar? The bar is so low that we're going to consider this a win. But that's what it seems to be. What struck me was, and I don't remember if it was in Act 4 or Act 5, but I think it's Act 5, when the older couple he's all bitter about not being able to buy their land. And he tells, Mephistopheles to take care of them. When he learns that they're dead, he actually takes that action into himself. And throughout the entirety of the first and second parts of the book, he never viewed any of the tragedies that had happened as being his fault or anything that he needed to internalize. I was kind of left with the impression that he did feel that it was entirely sitting upon his shoulders, this demise of this couple. Like he took that for his own mistake, his own error or downfall, or however it is he took it. He internalized it. So to me, I would say maybe we can point to that as progress, because throughout the other rest of the play, the two parts, he failed to do so. Everything was like, oh, woe is me. Why is this happening to me? Or it was somebody else's fault that it had happened. So that one part stood out to me as, maybe he did make progress. But I also was so super disappointed in that moment when I read that. It was just so, because I really did feel like, well, this was your last chance to show that you had truly grown. And so even though I can acknowledge that on some level there's growth because he's accepting the responsibility, I am left as the reader feeling that it was not enough growth. And I also felt like the ending was unjust. Like I don't think he should have gotten choirs of angels to ring him up anywhere. It's like, nah, dude, you just killed an old couple that was doing nothing to hurt you. And you had all this other land. You should burn in hell. I don't necessarily believe, to be clear, I don't really believe in concept of heaven or hell. But if I'm, as the reader, I'm immersing myself in this world, and both concepts have been fully explained to me. And as explained to me by the reader, by the author, I don't find that it was justified. I suppose from a purely technical perspective, considering that, Faust did not utter that phrase in the meaning in which it was intended, sure, I guess, his soul gets to not go with the devil. But I was really just disappointed in the character in general, which, that's a good, makes for a good story. If the author can, engender so much feeling in me, I think that that's a good thing. What I saw as themes throughout the entirety of the play was this constant, we were being told that this striving for the ideal is perhaps the surest path towards tragedy. We're shown that, like beauty and romance and the very idyllic, that's all great. But if you pursue that with a vacuum for something perhaps more, substantial, then you're just going to always end up in tragedy. And we see that throughout the story over and over with all these failed things and his failed romances. The very bizarre whole thing of his marriage and the demise of his marriage with Helen of Troy, it was perfect. It was like the way that it's described to us, it's perfection. Everything about it was like perfect. And then it just, and then the way in which it kind of fell apart was seemingly abrupt from the reader's perspective. And it seemed to be pointing out that seeking perfection will also get you towards tragedy if you don't and temper it with something more. And I think that if I wanted to give the main character something, it would be that he was contemplating that the return to nature or the focus on nature from that experience might have also been some type of a growth that he's portraying to us, in that he's switching his mind from solely seeking the idyllically beautiful and perfect, and now he is going to focus on improving the lot of someone, not himself, which is kind of the way I viewed that transition. But it occurred to me when he was bitter about the old couple not giving up their cottage and land, that maybe he had really not learned quite the lesson. It was presented to us, the reader, so that we could make sure that that was the lesson that we should be learning. But he himself didn't learn it because he switched from seeking beauty and perfection for himself to seeking beauty and perfection outside himself. And so yet again, he's left, it's, you know, the tragic ending was for something outside of himself, but it made a profound impact upon him. So I don't know, those are just my thoughts. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Madeline, could you read that quote that you read? I really like the quote from Goethe. Go ahead and read it, please.
Sure, yeah, it's from David E. Welberry, who's at the University of Chicago. And it's from the Goethe Lexicon website that's at pitt.edu. So the quotation in English is from Goethe, from his campaign in France. The beautiful is when we intuit that which is lawfully alive in its immense activity and perfection, through which we are stimulated to reproduce it and simultaneously feel ourselves alive and stirred to highest activity.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is going to be Paul, followed by Doug. Paul.
Yeah, thanks. I especially, Philip, I'm interested in your, after having read what he wrote about what he was doing, what you'll say about what I'm going to say, which is very much a question. I only come to Goethe from being a student of philosophy, where you run across him on the sidelines in a way, but that brought me to Faust on the sideline years and years ago. But it's a very specific question I have because of all that now. And you guys have really been helpful. So I'm with DW from my understanding, and I'll tell you why, that this ambiguous confusion we're talking about is totally intentional. I'd like to know if that's in what you read, and it's trying to capture what human condition is, and that there's no one moral, ethical message, and it's all about the context of each individual. And I say that because of his elements of philosophy. I had to Google it. I think it was called A Theory of Colors. Is that right? Something like that. But in that, he says he was fighting the sciences, going, oh, color, you can just say it's a frequency of light, blah. And you can use language to describe it as a frequency. But he said, I believe, BS, when I am moved to a beautiful natural ecstasy by the color green, it is not a 312 hertz frequency of light. So the same thing is the individual context, and you can't extract moral principles, because that's what's important. That's a question. Am I on even a vaguely track? And that's what I'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I think his philosophy of nature and his philosophy in general, they tend to overlap. So, you know, he wrote several scientific works such as Theory on Colors and Metamorphosis of Plants. And when you read those, you kind of see echoes of the same thing in Goethe, in Faust all over again. So Metamorphosis of Plants, the idea is that you have something that, like a germ in that plant, and it keeps budding into different things in different contexts. Like you're saying, in different contexts would behave and have different ethics. So you have this idea that life, you have this principle of life that is encapsulated in something, which is the essence of it. And then it keeps developing and it keeps expressing itself in different ways. So that's Metamorphosis of Plants. In the Theory of Colors, same idea, where yes, the light is not just a frequency, but it's something in the eye that how we perceive it. And so whatever we see it not just as something external, but it's some kind of thing that happens in the eye itself. Now, technically, he was proven to be incorrect. So we don't believe that light is something like that. However, the way, it doesn't matter though, from a certain perspective, because the way artists use color is not based on some frequency. They just have a way of presenting colors. And my understanding is artists still use some of Goethe's ideas about how different shades work. And a lot of the color palettes are based on his ideas and not just sort of technical ideas about how color changes just based on frequencies, right? And so it's a fascinating topic, I think.
Thank you. Again, I'm keeping track of all these general points that everybody has brought up. I mean, we have quite a formidable list of philosophical points, and but let's go with Joe and Doug, and then we will go to the general discussion. Joe.
Oh, gee, it's been so long. I kind of forgot what I was going to say. It was.
That's all right.
Sorry about that. It had something to do with enduring love during throughout the entire play, and I think that the only person's love that endures, and I think there's something to be said for this, is essentially God's. I mean, he forgives. God's. Did Doug ask? I thought I read your lips there. And I think there's something extremely powerful about that. And that's something that I think we should actually explore.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Doug. Doug.
Well, yeah, I really love that. That I think is the point, which is also sort of the point under Bucky's work is love. Love was like a monkey wrench that got work done. It wasn't a metaphysical strange thing. Love was the most pragmatic of tools. So that may be part of it. And I think that I liked what Maritza was saying, that, I think Faust's courage is at the beginning when he studied everything in the world in college and said, I know nothing. This does no good. That takes a lot of courage, as opposed to keep writing books and pretending you're an expert on the world, that this man has studied medicine, law, philosophy, the whole shebang, and says this means nothing. And I have to go out and experience things. I have to live life, which is, I think, also what the Beat Poets were trying to do. So I really loved also Allison's point of bringing in, and I think Madeline's quote here is right to the heart of that. But on Kerouac's on the road is this pilgrimage back and forth from east to west to east to west, trying to figure out America. And the way he gains sustenance is through finding local restaurants that serve their version of apple pie and ice cream and a good cup of coffee. And that's what he lives on because it's inexpensive. I mean, now if you crossed America, you're only going to find that near the highways in chain restaurants, and it's going to be the same kind of apple pie, ice cream. It's not going to be, you have to go way off the highway to find a place like in the woods of Poland. I was there and our host took us through and stopped in a little village and served us basically an apple dessert with ice cream and a cup of coffee. And it's a universal kind of standard, a quest for the Holy Grail, the perfect apple pie, the perfect ice cream, the perfect cup of coffee. And I think that but the beats are also, we think of it in terms of the beat of music, but the beats really, after winning World War II, were exhausted because the economy was trashed. They came back to not a great economy. There was a recession. There were terrible things happening. And they were beat. They were exhausted. They were felt beat up by a war and by an economy that didn't necessarily, I mean, some people survived it. My father came from a very poor background and got the GI Bill and got an education and did well. But a lot of the people were like Faust. This doesn't mean anything. And you also have, right at the peak of American success, you have Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman that comes out in 1951 that says this whole model of the American dream is bankrupt, and it's like finally 50 years later, we go, well, maybe Arthur Miller was right. Tennessee Williams was writing about mendacity and the kind of hypocrisy of the American dream. And so and the Beats were going, okay, we won the war, but we're exhausted, we're worn out, much like All Quiet on the Western Front is about the exhaustion of the German veterans of World War I. They come back and they lost the war, but here are people who won the war and they're beat, they're exhausted. So I think if Faust has a virtue, it's the admission that he has failed. And I think he goes, and I think there are mechanics. Okay, he actually does say, I'm going to move this old couple into a beautiful home. They're going to like it better than their own home. He has no connection to their emotional attachment to this home they've lived in forever. He's going to give them a better home. And that's the American dream. And he kills them in the process of trying to displace them into a better place, into the promised land that he's going to design and make happen. And this takes me back to some research I did recently on the West, and that Daniel Boone, we think of him as a pioneer and a discoverer. He was working for real estate companies when he broke into these new lands to create land to be sold and to displace Native Americans. And, he actually worked for real estate ventures that were trying to move west and find this, or like Faust, recover land from the sea so it can be sold and we can make money off of it. And I think Wagner picks up on some of that. I think Wedekind picks up on it in a play called Marquis of Kythe, which is about a developer of some kind who's just, you don't know whether he's a hero or a villain, but it's like this, we got money, we got plans, we're going to make the world, we're going to build the promised land. But it's very Eastern, and Kerouac was a really serious student of Buddha. And so the more things change, the more they will change again, and the more they will change again, and you'll build them up and they'll fall apart, and you build them up and they fall apart. And so I think Faust is pointing to that in a very scary way.
Thank you, Doug. So we'll take one last. Okay, that's fine. So what we'll do now is I want to now do a discussion on Goethe's philosophy, because this is a work of Goethe, and he's saying something. So what is he saying? Because let's kind of rise up from Faust himself to say, what is it that the author is saying about the world, about the human condition? I will rattle off various candidates that I heard in everything that everybody said. But I want you to also look at it and say which of these or something else are the fundamental questions and fundamental positions that Goethe is putting forth. Okay. So the first one is this conflict between form and, so I have how many points? I have 12 points. Oh no, 14 points, okay, that I heard right now from everybody. So I'm just going to recount all of them. So try to think of, so the question on the table is, what are the fundamental philosophical things that Goethe is saying? What are the questions he is raising? And what are his answers about fundamental philosophical things about human condition? First is the topic of form, the conflict between form and formless. Preference for the formless rather than empty forms. That's one point, this conflict. The second is deeds versus words. Is deeds primary or are words primary? What should you be focused on primarily and what? Third is Faust's quest for knowledge. What is Goethe saying about the quest for knowledge itself? Fourth, there should be no moment where you want to remain. What is the role of this continuous going on this quest? And what does it mean for you to be satiated. What is he saying about that? What is Goethe saying about ethics? What is the ethics underlying ethics that is being espoused implicitly throughout by Goethe? What is he saying about that? Next is, does Faust, what is Goethe saying about the growth that is possible to people or lack thereof? Next, what is he saying about the meaning of life? What is Goethe saying about the meaning of life? Is life meaningless, or does it have meaning? What does Goethe mean by that beautiful quotation that Madeline read and Joe has put in the chat? What is the meaning of that, of saying that the beautiful is when we intuit that which is lawfully alive in immense activity, and then you reflect that, you have it born through you and have both the activity and the joy as a result of that. What is the meaning of that? What is being said there? Next is the ending unjust or just? And what is he saying about that? Where does this all of these quests of us human beings, where does it end? What is the result of this? What is the proper approach to seeking? That is, I'm going to put that into the seeking of knowledge itself. Is Goethe a moral relativist, or is he espousing a particular morality, that there is a proper morality, though contextual, but is there a morality, or is there no morality? What is he saying about enduring love? And what is the role of acceptance that you don't know things? What does Goethe think about the role of that in human life, the place of that? These are some of the things these are the things that I've gleaned from everything that everybody has said. But now it's up to you guys. So first, don't try to answer any of them. Which do you think of these, or if you want to put it in a different way, what are the key philosophical points Goethe is putting on the table? What are the key questions? What are the key positions that are being put on the table? Let's just list them, which you think are crucial. And then we will go ahead and do a discussion of it. We'll start with Phil. Phil.
Yeah, I just want to mention in connection with this list that, there are a lot of things that are going on in this book. One of the things that's going on is taking a plot and using it in a symbolical, allegorical manner. And what's the allegory? Well, the allegory is, in one way, this conflict between form and formless, but in another way, it's also a dialogue between Romanticism as a movement in poetry and philosophy, and classicism / rationalism that's identified with, for instance, Greek classical culture. So the Goethe was part of the Sturm und Drang poetical group, which is storm and upheaval, if you will, which by its name, you can tell what it's about. It's about raw feeling. It's about feeling things. It's not about, it's anti-rational, anti-enlightenment in a way. And it's all about getting back to nature and feeling nature and not trying to describe it and dissect it and so on. So with that in mind, we can see that a lot of what's going on in Faust is this discussion about rational versus emotional, and which one has the upper hand, and which one is the one that we should use for ethics. Should we use some sort of rigid rationalist system for ethics versus more pragmatic, more bottom-up feeling approach, if you will? A lot of that is happening in this book. So that's another big theme I think that we should put on that list. Maybe it ties back to some of the other things you've listed there, Shrikant. I just want to mention that because it is a real thing. And of course, Goethe in his correspondence again mentions that as one of the motive forces for writing this in the first place. So the way part one is typically the romantic side of it. Part two is the more classic side of it, right? Part one is all about feeling, passion, right? Faust and Gretchen. Part two is about Faust and Helen. It's not about passion. It's about this idealistic quest for beauty, which yields Euphorion, their progeny. And Euphorion is supposed to be the spirit of poetry, which is very interesting because you get romanticism on this side and maybe some medieval culture, and you get classicism on this side, and they together, the union results in something else, but that progeny dies, it perishes, which again raises all kinds of questions. What are you saying, Goethe? Are you saying that there is no real way for us to unify these two different opposing forces in a human psyche? So I just want to bring that up. That's all.
Wonderful, wonderful, excellent point. Next up is going to be Doug, followed by Mike. Doug, what do you think are the key themes? Doug, you need to unmute.
I think very briefly, I would say they center around this theme of love, which may or may not be explored very well in the action of the play, but it does explore the feminine, and that sort of, and the sort of, well, I want to say this briefly. I lived with a dancer for about 4 or 5 years, helped raise her daughter, and then she taught act. She was an improvisational dancer and a dance therapist, and knew a lot about psychology and philosophy, and she was raised Mormon like I was, and we would sort of, in the time we were together, sometimes rewrite Mormon hymns into things like "Oh Holy Pie," which art up in the sky, or something like that. It was sort of this approach, and we would talk a lot about the fertile void, this thing that everybody's afraid of, the night, the dark, that thing, the emptiness, the failure, and like but sometimes the failure, if you rest in that and pay attention to it, is the fertile land from which something can grow. And I think this play has so many failures in it. It's maybe that's why it's so fertile. I don't know. So the fertile void may be a theme related to the feminine, related to love.
Wonderful. So I'll put that as so the three themes so far, because now you are actually voting for the ones that you really want to talk about. Okay, so one is rational versus emotion, so romanticism versus classicism. Second is a theme of love, and I'm going to add the fertile void as a third one. So we will keep adding things. So if any of the things that I listed, if you want to discuss them, please go ahead and add them. We are preparing a list for talking about these things.
Right.
Mike, which themes would you like to add?
Could I say one more thing on that? Just, this is also the time when Eastern literature was entering Germany and then going to the transcendental philosophers. So that may be worth exploring, of what Goethe is integrating from the East. That was hitting Germany very hard in the 18th, 19th century.
What is coming from the East?
The first translations of the Gita, for example, went to Germany and then to the transcendentalists.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mike, what are the key philosophical themes or questions that Goethe is raising in Faust? Just the list.
Okay. I feel that what he's done is he rephrased Dante's Inferno and Ecclesiastes, which both Phil and Doug brought out in related words. The battle, always dichotomy, but it's not just two sides. You need to consider all sides. And good and evil is one of the issues that went on.
Okay.
Another one was science and religion. Faust wanted to. Faust, in a way, was a scientist too, even in his own way. individuality, morality. So I think he covered everything that the Koheles did in Ecclesiastes, except he rephrased it in Faustian terms.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. That's a very good point. I mean, this is truly a great work. It's truly a great work, just like Dante, because he just brings up, all the key issues in his own way. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Madeline. Joe.
I think what Phil had brought up was actually profound in this. We're comparing and contrasting the distinction between deeds and words.
Okay.
I think that that's probably the most important thing to actually, one of the most important things to explore. If you think about it in terms of just how people use words and they're empty. And there was even a part where Mephistopheles encourages, I believe, the student to memorize words. And so to memorize words is to lack critical thinking. And the distinction between this is that we get into ideas of, say, experiencing the world versus actually, talking about it. And there's an intellectual aspect to that. And intellectualism, criticism of intellectualism, I think, in a particular way. So I think that that's worth exploring in a deeper way.
Thank you, Joe. I will put that as an additional point, because it is very much connected to the empty form versus the potential that exists in the formless, the Tao versus the 10,000 words, So next up is going to be Madeline. Madeline, what do you think of the key themes?
Well, this is a follow-on to something that Phil said, which was about how Romanticism and Classicism play out in the plot. So they play out in the action of the plot, and they do play out in the characters. We could say, as a rough approximation, that Faust is a romantic and Mephistopheles is a rationalist who believes that mountains were formed by geological forces, for example. And then I got to thinking, well, maybe these two also play out in the structure of the play as a whole. So what if we looked at part one as being Romanticism? He's all about feelings, people and feelings of attachment, feelings of sublime. The second part, and it doesn't have a lot of, there's no particular logic in the motion from place to place. I mean, there's movement, they're going up the mountain, etc. The second part, it's very structured in terms of history. Now history has entered the picture. It goes through different stages, including the medieval stage, which we discussed, but it doesn't end there. And each of those stages of history has its own things that play out. I'm thinking that at the end, I really don't know what Goethe had in mind at the very end, with the sudden ascension into heaven. I really do kind of get the sense that he just wasn't sure what else to do, in a way, because it doesn't, to my mind, it doesn't bring together really the themes of Romanticism and Classicism. It doesn't really bring together the container and the content. It just seems to sort of leave history behind and leave the world behind, and now we're in the Paradiso. But other than that sort of odd turn at the end, I do think part two would reflect Classicism in terms of its structure, as well as its content, its emphasis on the public realm, public works, the way that, say, with many tropes from Ovid and concerns of Marcus Aurelius. Yeah, so that was it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. All right, so now we are in the middle of discussion, and I think, the theme that Phil brought up of romanticism and rationalism, I think it's a great way of integrating. So I just want to run through everything here, all the points, and just build.
Can I add one?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just one more point. The book ends on this mysterious line about the eternal feminine drawing us upwards. I mentioned this to Doug earlier. It's super interesting that that's how it, it's very important to see how something starts and how something ends. The writer spends a lot of time on ending and beginnings. So the way he ends it with this line, the eternal feminine may draw us on high, raises this point of what is the role of the feminine in this work. I mean, we have so many pivotal heroines in the book, right? Gretchen, Helen, and then this mysterious mention of the mothers, which baffle both Mephistopheles apparently and Faust. The mothers, the divine feminine that is more ancient and deeper than the devilish and even the classical tradition. And throughout, we have this idea that the quest for beauty is connected with the feminine, and the feminine is also connected with this idea of movement and form, or content, getting in, formulating form, and so on. So all of this development, and it's all kind of permeated with this idea of the feminine. So I want to bring that up as another topic theme that is both interesting, mysterious, and I think kind of intriguing personally, I think, as a topic.
Yeah, this is so amazing. So I don't know, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to try to pull all of this around this theme, because in some sense the eternal feminine is the, like, if you look at the Tao, it's like, it's like the yin, because the yang, which becomes sterile, or these forms which become meaningless, it's like the names that, the 10,000 things and the names for them, which are no longer living at that point, and you kind of have to go back to the Tao in order to rework that. So this idea of rationalism, which has become arid, which has become no longer, which is not really producing knowledge, as Doug was saying. It's like Faust saying that this is not knowledge. What I have is not knowledge. That I really want to go back to nature. I really want to commune and try to get that. And then the journey of doing that, the complexity of doing that. So that runs through everything. It's like that's the deeds versus words which are no longer being converted into flesh, but they are kind of sterile. It is the same thing about kind of form and formless, like going back to the formless to kind of go back to the chaos, going back to the potential and trying to redraw that, because the forms that you're using are no longer meaningless. This is the quest of knowledge. So I see that theme bringing, and the role of love in this, the fertility of the void, what is coming from the East, where does East come in here? What is being said about good and evil? Again, the ethics, which is there, which is kind of, again, whenever the classical ethics kind of becomes, I'm using the word sterile again and again, but I don't see a better word. But kind of going back to say, okay, what is the right thing to do, and kind of thinking afresh from it. It's kind of going back to the functions underneath the forms. Again, the issue of science and religion there. So I see that as a, as a major major themes. So let's go ahead. Let me go ahead, and now you're welcome to comment on any of these things. I'm going to open it up. We put several things on the table. Please go ahead and talk about what is Goethe saying. What is, if you wanted to summarize, what is Goethe saying to us with this entire work? He's covered everything, but what is he saying? What is his core message? What is he holding up? I'm going to start with Doug. Doug, you need to unmute.
Okay, I found it. Well, I've been looking at, because Phil sort of mentioned this last speech, and I've been looking at different translations of it, and the Greenberg one is actually quite good in terms of connecting to something. A friend of mine is doing a show here at the Philosophical Research Society, which is the Manly P. Hall thing that is an attempt to study all the world's religions and synthesize them. And I heard something the other day that the whole world is perceived as a symbol of God, or each man is perceived as a symbol of God. And so these ideas of what passes away and what endures is not necessarily anything we know in life in terms of the physical reality. But the Greenberg translation says, it's very crisp and it's very efficient. It says, everything transitory is symbolic only. All insufficiency here is made good. The not expressible here is pure word. Woman eternally shows us the road, which brings up On the Road, Kerouac. I mean, it's kind of of all the ones I've compared, and I haven't compared all of them that I have, but this one is the most efficient and connects to themes we've been talking about for 2 or 3 years.
Can you read it one more time, please?
And then I'll type it in. Everything transitory is symbolic only. All insufficiency here is made good. The not expressible here is pure word. Woman eternally shows us the road.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, he really took enough time to distill, I think, that verse into really clear English.
Wonderful. So folks, any thoughts about what is Goethe saying? This is, we are coming towards the end. We got about half an hour to pull everything together. So any thoughts about what is Goethe saying? Start with Joe, Madeline, and Yulia. Joe.
I mean, I think that there are so many different things that he's saying. But I think that ultimately he's talking about the desire for knowledge in a way that how that provides meaning in your life. And that rational knowledge is simply not enough. And what I mean by that, and I think that rational knowledge is not enough in the sense that the way, not only he wants to understand nature, but he also wants to dominate nature. So that it's almost, and I brought this up in a previous session, that he actually almost wants the same knowledge as God. I feel like this is Faust. But what is Goethe saying? I think that Goethe is saying that how do we find meaning in our lives? And I think he says it through a number of different characters. I think if you read all the characters in the book, they all find meaning in different ways. Even the people in I sounded ignorant, but in Auerbach's Cellar, what they found to be meaningful, and what the townspeople found to be meaningful, what Wagner, the comparing and contrasting of Wagner, is very interesting. And what he found satisfaction in creating the Hermogenes and just studying rational knowledge, just studying in a lavatory, where that wasn't sufficient for Faust. So I think in a way he's saying we all create our own meaning, and we do it in different ways. That's some of the impressions that I've gotten anyway. Whether that's accurate, that's my initial thoughts when I read.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Madeline, Yulia, and Maritza. Madeline.
Yes, well, I think that last passage certainly is about the theory of forms, that eternal feminine drawing man eternally upwards. The other theme the big theme about direction in part 2 was at the very depths, way down below the very bottom of the world, sort of down in the sub-basement, on the dirt floor, below all the structures are the mothers and the cauldron. And I believe he was referring to the oracle at Delphi, which was a 3-legged, it's got a whole thing. Anyway, and so I think that for him, I'm sorry, Ella seems to have dropped out of the group, but she had also picked up on the theme that all of these women are really an anima figure for Faust. And so for a man, the anima figure would represent, at least in this, the highest and the lowest, the unknown, and sort of the ultimate other. And the site of his own action, S-I-T-E, site, would be in the world. I don't think it makes up for the eternal feminine being paid 75% of what the eternal masculine gets paid in the world. But still, as we discussed in some previous session, it'd be interesting to see if and how this could be rewritten with Faust and Mephistopheles as women. And how the whole thing would play out. I don't know about the pregnancy part, but everything else might be doable.
Thank you, Madeline. Go ahead. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Yulia, followed by Maritza. Yulia.
Hi. So to the question of what is Goethe saying, I'm not sure if this is what he actually meant to say, and probably not. But I think for the reader, the play seems to indicate that life is too complicated for us to get it right, and so God just forgives everyone. So no matter how much evil you do on earth, you will be forgiven, because it's just too complex and no mortal is able to do it correctly. And the reason I think that is, as Maritza pointed out, the reader believes Faust should be going to hell in the end. He hasn't done anything to redeem himself. And even with that little bit of kind of like a tiny, tiny bit of self-awareness that he exhibits at the end of saying, oh, I shouldn't have sent Mephistopheles off to kill these two poor people, he's still mostly blaming Mephistopheles for it. So he never really truly takes responsibility. He never really truly grows, morally. So that's just how it seems to me. I'm sure that's not actually what Goethe meant to say, but I think it might be what the reader takes away from it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yulia. Thank you. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Paul. Maritza.
I will say that at the end, I was left with a very, very metallic and heavy-handed taste of religiosity being shoved down my throat. It was very much, I got the feeling that it was preachy, the idea of, your religion will save you, as it were, if you have, you know, I don't know, because he didn't have faith. So that's another thing. This character did not have faith. So the only thing I can deduce is that the author is saying to me that regardless of any true belief, if you keep striving forward, even if you do so in a very erratic, errant, and misguided way, you will be uplifted at the end of time. That's a very, very Bible perspective, as it were. Which and in that I will say that very last bit really left a poor taste in my mouth. But that is the ultimate. It seems like that's the ultimate answer that the author is leaving me with. It's not the impression I got throughout the entirety of the novel. So it was almost, I don't know, shocking might be a little strong, but I had been thinking that perhaps the author was trying to point us towards a rejection of seeking this, inner experience and fulfill, or was trying to steer us away from seeking fulfillment through pursuits that were solely self-serving, and to instead seek these experiences, to seek knowledge through outside, perhaps outside experiences that would improve. Sure, your lot is fine, but what if you can improve humanity, as it were? That's kind of what I thought he was getting at. And so I was kind of feeling really hopeful that the end would be something. And maybe Allison is right. Maybe it's our American sentimentality and our desire for this like eternal happy ending. But I mean, but you got that. You got the happy ending. So I don't know. It's funny because it's almost like the novel itself negates that statement, because he gave us the happy ending. But I guess maybe the fact of the matter is we don't really want the happy ending if it doesn't seem like you earned it. Like, can you at least lie to me and have him like break down into tears when the old couple died, or like something or put something in about him never getting past that? But he doesn't. So and I guess my thinking, perhaps if I had to try to put myself in the mind of the author, I don't think he himself knew exactly what he wanted to give the reader as a message. I think he had ideas, and maybe he was trying to point us into like certain paths, like Philip spoke about the feminine, and Doug, this concept, this entreaty to feminine, but I don't see a lesson in the women presented throughout the book. I will say, for the time, we didn't get an impression so much of their choices in the beginning. They were also collateral damage of Faust seeking his experience. So the only feminine with any type of power that to me I saw in the book was nature herself. Nature towards the end, she was this, this was nature so powerful that, there's land in the bottom of the sea that's gonna, nature is going to allow to be revealed through Faust. And so I'm not convinced I'm answering your question, Shikant. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Marisa. But I want to ask a follow-up question about this to Phil. Phil, I mean, you rightly said that people are very, any artist wants to get the ending. Ending is very deliberate. What Marisa seems to be saying is that the ending, from her perspective, seems to be kind of out of place. It's a surprising ending. So the question to you is that, what is this ending and what is its meaning? What is Goethe doing with this ending? And how would you characterize what is he saying with the ending?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I will say this though, because I'm getting a sense that a lot of people have this disarray, like what did we end up with after reading all of this? Is there a central theme or answer in a sense? And I think there is, but it may not be to your liking, which is this. When we first meet God in heaven in Mephistopheles, and again, you have to really pay attention to the beginnings and the endings. One of the things that Mephistopheles says about mankind is this, and he says it to God, by the way. He says, you've blessed them, or at least you think that's a blessing. You've blessed them with this thing that they now put on a pedestal, which is rationality. But it only makes them more miserable. In fact, it makes them so miserable, I don't want to plague them, as much as I really ought to. I don't want to, stress them out more than I have to, because I see how miserable they are already with this thing that supposedly is a blessing. Now, that right there is a theme, which is this. Rationality is not the answer. You have to experience life, not just think about it and come up with some rational program and follow that. You can't do that. It doesn't work. It ends up producing a stillborn child like Euphorion, which is kind of alive, but then he vanishes as quickly as he arrives on the scene. And so that's a theme right there that seems to go along with Faust's desire for experience. In other words, experience in itself has a value. Now, implicitly, though, which we may not agree with this, apparently Goethe thinks that that's worth some people getting, swept aside, if you will. Now, we are so moral and we're so keen on judging everybody and like saying, okay, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. The reality of it is, if you think of Faust not as an individual, not as a single individual, but as a movement of humanity, we have done this and we have not batted an eye. And nobody's crying about, the peasants getting off their lands and so on. It just happens. Faust, if you think of Faust not as a single individual, but as just like Adam represents mankind, Faust represents mankind. And when you look at it through that lens, mankind is insatiable in its lust for the most beautiful, the deepest things. I mean, and we will stop at nothing. Now, where does the feminine come in? Well, the feminine, like somebody already mentioned, is this thing, the carrot that's dangling in front of us, which represents both desire, beauty, some kind of ideal thing, some kind of form that needs to be filled with content. And we're trying to provide this content, and so is Faust. And originally, his content was, well, let's just do it at the basest layer, which is, I'm just going to have a romantic experience with Gretchen. Then it moves a layer, I want to be in power. I want to do this ruling thing. Finally, we reach the other part of it, which is nature. I want to rule over nature. I want to actually say to the ocean, stop. I'm going to make a barrier and I'm going to create this land out of nothing, kind of like God, basically, and put people on it, and they will then somehow have this utopia on this land. So that to me are things that tie this together, and the eternal feminine is like an ideal. But as Goethe says, the preference is for the formless content. The preference is for striving to that ideal, not the ideal itself. I think that's the big theme that I come away with, is that you have to have an ideal, but by itself, it's dead. So like classical idealism, which neoclassicism was a very popular thing in Europe, but romanticism was a rejection of just following an ideal. It was about getting in touch with nature, going out there, not sitting in a cellar, poring over medieval manuscripts and so on, but getting out there, listening to the waterfall, listening to the birds singing, etc., and somehow getting into this direct, unmediated contact with the world. And of course, that means that sometimes you get into this unmediated contact and there are casualties along the way. And that's what makes it so brilliant, this work, is that Goethe, he doesn't hide it. He doesn't hide the collateral damage. He doesn't hide the fact that it's complicated. And that's why this work is so deep. Just like, in a lot of ways in Dostoevsky doesn't take a side necessarily. It's implied, but he gives you like 10 different people with different philosophies. You pick the one that you agree with. Here we have the same thing. We have Mephistopheles, who is kind of cynical, pragmatic, very down to earth, not very idealistic at all. And ultimately, he doesn't want to fill anything with content. He doesn't want to strive for anything. That's his motto, is like nothingness. The world shouldn't even exist. He's the spirit of negation, denial. Faust is like, if he's the minus sign, Faust is the plus sign of that magnet, right? He wants to fill the universe with himself, with his content, with maybe I'm painting a kind of a lurid picture here, but that's what he's doing. He wants to reach every corner, the highest heaven, the lowest hell.
Phil, that was excellent, but I'm going to ask a follow-up question in a more pointed way. Why does Faust go to heaven?
Well, we have two answers, right, from Goethe. One is, and where I had it written somewhere, it literally says, a striving soul we can redeem. That's what the angels tell. So his striving is what gets him off the hook, just like we were just talking about. The second one is a little bit more, maybe moralistic, which is this: Gretchen interceded for him. So we have love. Love is going to save the world. And we have two, if the, what's the saying about trying harder? If it doesn't work, try harder, something like that. There you go. Those are the two.
Got it. Excellent. Amazing, amazing. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Next up is going to be Paul. Let's see. Paul, Allison, and Doug. Paul.
Yeah, that explanation pretty much, I don't have much to say now because they're so beautiful. That has already been said, except I really liked what Julia said, and I think the points about romanticism are really important, because there's a thing of, we can't really, in the modern theory of mind, that you can't really know what's going on in someone else's head. So we know he was a striver. Dare we really judge all the things that forced him into the actions he took? And that kind of vibe might be in there. And you can't, with some codified, strict set of rules, define morality. It's much more complicated than that. And so I just wanted to add those parts to what you said. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Allison.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Phil, and because I feel like the ending just felt wrong in a way. Like it didn't feel true. And it felt like when you're watching some movie and it's just taking you to all these crazy places, and then it's like the cheap ending when they're like, and then they woke up and it was all a dream, and you're like, that, no, I need a real ending, and that, like, this felt like a fake end. It kind of felt like he wrote it that way because he was writing during such a religious time that was the ending that he knew people felt that they needed. But I don't buy that that's what he really felt. I think Goethe thought this was the way to live, have all these experiences. I mean, and the thing is, like, not everybody goes along with the religious thing. It's kind of like, especially like nowadays, it's more acceptable to just want a life of experiences. But for a long time, that was, there was a lot of shame involved with that. But I think that he, like, that's what he thought was the best way to live. But he kind of had to hide it at the end. I mean, a lot of authors do this, where they they write things a certain way, and then they're sort of hiding what they really believe in it, because they've got to make it acceptable to the world in which they're writing. Authors do it, dancers, artists, they've always done it. Like, whatever the society is, they have to make what they're producing palatable, so they don't, either so it gets published, or so they're not, condemned to death for it, or whatever. So sometimes the story is not really the story. The story is kind of hidden inside it. And I think, he's not going to, at that era, it's not like he could go like, hey, this is the way to do it. Like the Beats could get away with it, and Hemingway could get away with it. But back then he couldn't get away with it. So he had to give it the ending that everybody would want. Oh, he's very safe at the end. And, but I can't buy that at the very end, he's on his deathbed and he makes the oh, wait, I was wrong all along. Until 5 minutes ago, I lived a different way, but I was wrong. It just doesn't, it's not authentic. It didn't seem true.
But he doesn't say he was wrong. He doesn't
No, I
actually.
know he doesn't say he was wrong, but it
Yeah.
just felt like a pat little, all right, tie it up with a bow ending to make people happy, but it's not really, it didn't seem true to his character at all.
So I mean, based on whatever I know, the fact that, I mean, the biggest fact is that it was not published. I mean, he didn't publish it, right? Until his death. I mean, that was, isn't that correct, Phil?
Yes, he right. He wrote it.
He did not. Yeah,
he was writing it for 30 years, on and
right.
off.
Right.
So,
But,
or longer. I forget. It's like one of the.
so I don't see him thinking about the implications of it at all to other people. I don't think this is something that is shaped. Any of this work is shaped by how people will take it. I think this is what he thinks.
Yeah.
Especially like if you're saying, I'm not going to even publish it. I'm just going to write it for myself because I want to capture what I think in the deepest possible way. So that's my take. What do you think, Phil, about this? Is this Goethe or is this not Goethe?
No, I think it is. I think it absolutely is. And here's again how, I mean, I have an interpretation of it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the interpretation, but here goes. So we have this person who is striving, who's experiencing the world, who is, that's his quest in life. He is out there, he's experiencing everything. But we'd also see that there's some problems, to put it mildly, right? There's some collateral damage. And we have this figure at the end there, Dr. Marianus. Dr. Marianus, we only meet him for a very short time, but he's the only other doctor that we know. Well, there's three doctors, Faust, Wagner, and Marianus. Marianus is also a man of science, apparently a man of experience, excuse me. But he is also in harmony. He's not restless like Faust. So maybe, and he's the one, by the way, I think, who is quoting those lines about the eternal feminine, or maybe it's the chorus of the angels just before him. But regardless, he's right there in that context. And perhaps we will speculate that he is the ideal Faust. He is the Faust that Faust should have been, incorporating some kind of morality, some kind of vision of the beautiful into his quest, which kind of keeps him on track and keeps him away from mowing everything over just for the sake of experience. So that may be a way to reconcile this ending with what we've seen of Faust. Faust himself is obviously guilty of all kinds of things, but he gets redeemed. He gets a 5. I mean, it gets like an A. He gets an A for trying, and he gets an A because somebody loves him, which is kind of very romantic in a romantic sense, not in a romanticism sense, which, love is what ultimately covers multitude of sins, right? That's what it says in the Gospels. And we have examples of these women who were sinful, but they also were forgiven. Now, the difference there, of course, with them and Faust is that they actually changed their lives and they admitted their guilt, which Faust never does. That's what really bugs us. He never admits that he's wrong about anything. So the question is, maybe he isn't. Maybe he isn't wrong about, and this is, again, if you look at him, not as an individual, but as a symbolic figure, as a figure that embodies mankind as a whole, then maybe mankind is not guilty by trying to search and trying to fill with content and trying to create new things, even though we have kind of collateral damage along the way. So that's how I interpret it. I see it as this idea of a perfect union between God, nature, and mankind. And it's very medieval in a lot of ways. It goes back to Dante. I mean, honestly, right? Because Dante had that same idea that you unite everything into this, you unite the classical mythology, the Christian theology, and you unite nature, which is part of the creation, man. Everything is this in perfect union when we fix our loves, our desires. That was his idea, right? Here we have something similar, except for this additional caveat that don't put rationality on the pedestal. and don't make that the ultimate guiding principle. You have to make experiencing the world the ultimate guiding principle. I don't know if I agree with him there, but that seems to me like that's the overarching theme.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Next up is going to be Doug, Joe, and Madeline. Doug.
Well, I'm not convinced that Faust ends up in heaven or in anything that we would normally define as heaven. I don't think that's really quite what's going on here. But I really love the women involved in this group and the skepticism of, guy's a jerk. Why is he getting off so easy? I mean, there seems to be a really wonderful kind of skepticism. And that may be why Roger Shattuck says Mary Shelley deals with the male ego better than Goethe does, in Faust, that she actually leaves them in an Arctic wasteland, But the other thing I wanted to focus on was the bonds of the flesh. And I think when they melt, I think everyone enters probably a state of like ecstasy at death. At some point after decades, I began to intuit that when we die, it's not heaven or hell. It's like, it's a dispersion of energy, and it may be temporary. Maybe we then land in the bardo. But I think what Goethe escapes is being held into this physical reality, which means the devil would still control him, because the devil controls physical reality. And somehow he slips through a crack because the devil is distracted by a simulation of a beautiful woman. And it throws his eye off the ball, and Faust slips through a crack through some trick pulled on Mephistopheles. So there's a very weird kind of double whammy going on about Mephistopheles as one kind of animus and Faust maybe is another, and the other characters that you mentioned that appear at the end that are a different kind of very Jungian stuff going on here. But the other thing I wanted to focus on is classical physics: earth, air, water, fire. And I have to go back and track this at the end, but at some point Goethe shows Earth going crazy, I think, with earthquakes or landslides and storms and wind, and like kind of what we're doing with climate change right now, and floods and fires. A fire takes out the couple. I mean, he's going back to the four elements, losing any form of control, and everything starts to turn to chaos. And then Faust, has some sort of moment of bliss, and as soon as he's happy to rest in a moment, he's dead. It's not like he slips the bond. Well, he does end up slipping the bonds of Mephistopheles, but what he says earlier, it's not about the wager. He says, if I ever am happy to rest, let me die. And that is exactly when he dies, is when he stops paddling forward and trying to get to the Paradise Island, in the future. I mean, he just surrenders and he disappears. So this thing, when the bonds of physical reality are loosened, the tremendous explosion of energy, Faust actually kind of explores that in the theatricality of storms, floods, fires. And he's putting those on stage, at least in his mind. It wasn't staged in his lifetime, this part of it. But there's also a Russian acting teacher, Michael Chekhov, who goes extensively into earth, air, water, fire, and that earth you mold, and water and kind of molds you. You float on water, and air you kind of mold and float. Flying is a kind of a thing, and then radiation is another more spiritual thing of energy moving out. And he was such a spiritualist. He had a nervous breakdown in Russia. He was one of Stanislavski's best acting students. And he had a nervous breakdown, and he put himself back together with Eastern philosophy, teachings of Rudolf Steiner, and he escaped Russia. He would have gone to the camps if he'd stayed in Russia. He would have been killed by the Stalinist forces, but he escaped, and he ended up teaching. He's actually in a weird movie playing a psychologist, but he was a teacher of Marilyn Monroe and Yul Brynner and Jack Palance. He became one of the great acting teachers in LA who saw the actor as a psychophysical athlete. And so I think his ideas suddenly hit me that there's this sort of, that's where I think he fuses the classical physics with the the romantic physics, where everything's more chaotic, because he suddenly takes the classical physics and it becomes those huge storms that we see in Mary Shelley, and the huge cold and the terrible cold and the terrible floods and the sea going crazy, and going to the mountaintops where, you know, you're hitting nature at its most intense or most beautiful. And so in a strange way, I think on that level of theatrics, he's fusing the classical and the Sturm und Drang romantic vision. You know, it's not all, oh, these four forces all in balance. No, the four forces, you know, turn into Sturm und Drang. So I think in that sense, he's setting up. Anyway, that's enough.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Madeline. Joe.
I'm just going to be very brief. I find it interesting, and I really like how Phil talked about focusing on the beginning and the end, because I really think that captures a lot of what this play is about. You know, if you think about it, the idea that this continually striving is a form of way of salvation. I find that interesting because it's kind of a paradox. It's kind of, in a way, it's you have, that's what gets Faust in trouble, is that constant striving. In a way, he makes a deal with the devil in order to continue to have experiences. So it's also his salvation. So it's a little bit confusing in that regard. But I do think that the play is about that. I mean, you know, ultimately, I think it is about constantly striving. But I think that there's also, and I'm trying to think of this out loud, I think there is a morality in this, into accepting the limitations that we have on ourselves as well. I think that would be a part of the morality aspect of it. When we're constantly striving, that we don't necessarily make a deal with the devil in order to get what we want, and that we see ourselves part of something bigger. That's just another, and I just came up with that. I don't know if it's accurate or not. So
thank you. Thank you, Joe. Phil, let me ask you another question. In the beginning and the end and the progression at a very high level, how does this compare with the story of Job? Because there is a lot of parallels here. You know, there is this conversation between God and the devil. There's a poor guy, you know, guy on earth. It's about him, and the devil does a whole bunch of things to him, and he perceives, and he struggles. Both of them struggle, and then, you know, at the end they win. I mean, that on that scale, that's the only story that I know that is very close in the general structure. How would you compare Book of Job to this one?
Well, I think, you know, and Goethe didn't hide the fact that he used the story of Job as the setup, right? The initial setup is very much the same, where you have essentially a bet, but then it diverges completely, because Job is about man's submission to God. God is the ultimate mystery. He has the ultimate say on us, and we really can't question him. I mean, that's really the message there. But the message of Faust is completely different, where God really is mentioned, but then he recedes into nothingness. I mean, he's not really even present in the end at all. Whereas in the book of Job, God appears out of the whirlwind and he says, I'm going to start asking you questions. Nothing like that happens in Faust. God is very perspicuously absent from that book, you know, from the tragedy. And then again, the message is diametrically different. Faust is all about man striving. Job is about man submitting and admitting his shortcomings. So it's really polar in that regard, because Job is saying, I can't fathom the universe. The universe is so much bigger than me. I have to be somewhat limited, and I'm going to accept these limitations. Faust is saying, no, I have unlimited lust and thirst for knowledge, for experience, for everything. and I'm just going to go out there and try to get as far as I can, and I'm not going to look back. So it's really that different in that setup.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Next up is Madeline.
Wow, thank you, Phil, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to have to go right after this. Let's see. So several things. One is I was thinking whenever this group picks up again, I think Madame Bovary would be a very good book for the group. We have a woman who is pursuing her own dreams of romanticism and brings about her own downfall and that of those around her. And it's an excellent and very tightly written work. So I was thinking about why we make that weird turn to heaven at the end of this. And I think it goes back to what Joe said during the last session, which was that the reason that God accepted the bet with Mephistopheles about Faust was that God had already lost. Faust had already decided to kill himself. This is what Joe had said, basically, and let me know if I'm wrong, Joe. He had already decided to kill himself. The only thing that had stopped him was the memory of a feeling from childhood of the sacred. Remember those bells ringing on Easter morning? So there was still something there, but it was the memory of a feeling from childhood. Then at the very end, so he's going through all his stuff here in the world, and he's flying around, and he's going to Greece, and he's coming back. At the very end, it almost doesn't matter that he is a real estate developer and looking around, declaring free men working on free land, even though he's basically, whatever, to get the people and the land. In that moment, he looks around and says, all is as it should be in the world. Everything is fine just the way it is. So in a sort of religious sense, that's like an affirmation of the rightness of God's creation and the rightness of the way everything is in the world. And so that is the moment when he dies. And that is the moment when God gets his soul. Because even though he dies happy approving of the world as God made it, just the way it is, and his place in it. He's no longer yearning for more, different, something else. And then just on a final note, I am still troubled by the fact that Goethe does not close out the nesting stories in this. He doesn't put the final right-hand parentheses at the very end with the frame story, the two frame stories actually, so two close parentheses. One is the people in the theater, and the other is his memory of his boyhood friend. Oh. And as some of you may remember, I was keeping track of the levels of frame stories in Frankenstein. And it just bugs me that Goethe didn't do that. And I don't know why he didn't do it. If it doesn't really make sense for this. It does kind of make sense for the structure. I don't know. Anyway, thank you all so much. It's been just incredible to be on another journey through another great book with you all. I get so much out of these groups. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. Shrika, you're on mute.
My fault. If for the last words, I'm going to give it first to Doug and then final words to Phil. Doug, go ahead.
Well, I just very briefly, I think Goethe, in this unleashing of the bonds of physical reality, I read there's a telegram that Bucky wrote to somebody trying to explain Einstein's breakthrough and the nature of E equals mc squared. And it's the first time I really realized he's talking about when physical, and Oppenheimer's often put in a Faustian concept, the developers of the atomic bomb. But what when the way Bucky describes it in this telegram, you really get the feeling that when energy lets loose, it's not energy going it goes out as a sphere. And that's where the c squared E equals mc squared, is that the speed of light is squared. And so it's it's 196,000 miles per second squared. So it's this huge explosion. And the initial Los Alamos footage of that explosion, it forms a ball before it forms an explosion in the cloud. So it seems like Goethe is anticipating something there, but I keep wanting to go back to Mary Shelley and Goethe, and then even Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, because Charles Dickens is the rich and the poor in this, but the way Jane Austen analyzes how money moves through a family is like, she's got an anthropologist's eye for what the male ego will do with the inheritance and how they can talk themselves into ignoring responsibility for the mother and their sisters while they do what's the right thing to do. And so I think these women like Jane Austen and Mary Shelley, I keep thinking of this book in relationship to what Mary Shelley does with Frankenstein. And I don't want that to distract me what Faust is doing here. I mean, I feel like my journey on Faust has just started, and this is the second time I've read it, and I didn't even read it very thoroughly the last 2 or 3 acts. I do want to recommend, which I recommended, there is a theater version from a Scottish theater, a translation by Robert David MacDonald, and it was for the Citizens Company in Glasgow, Scotland. And this isn't the cover that it's published with now, but it's a very cut version to be performed in one night or one day or whatever. And you actually can get the sweep of the play, and it's an incredibly good translation to capture the humor. Probably cuts a lot of the philosophy out, but it really gets the drama and the humor and the thrust of the storyline. And so I sometimes jump from this to the more detailed translations, because the detailed translations, I tended to fall over like a tree, just not knowing what to make of it. I mean, I felt like I'd met my match with Goethe on this. It was like my brain just gave up at some point.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug. Next up, for the final words, I'll go to Phil. Phil, go ahead.
Right. Well, it's hard to put a period at the end of this long journey, but I think congratulations, first of all, to everyone who has persevered with us throughout this. And I know, Doug, you said it's been a challenge, but it is a challenging work, but it is so rewarding as well. I've enjoyed thoroughly going through it again. I want to say a couple of quick things about interpretation. I was reading letters that Goethe and Schiller were exchanging as Goethe was sharing parts of the play as it was, being written. And one of the things that comes out there is the fact that they both agree with a subject matter like Faust. This work has to be both poetical and philosophical. So if you have trouble, then maybe you're just looking at one side of it. The poetical side, that's the plot, that's the individual. The philosophical part of it is the more abstract themes that come out of it. Faust being, again, a symbol and an archetype of humanity as a whole. And so both sides have to be taken into account when one looks at it. I think we've done a pretty good job at trying to look at it from different perspectives in this group. But yeah, definitely the philosophical versus the poetical is something to keep in mind. I think the other side is this constant tension that's maintained in the book because of the tension in our own nature. And the tension is between the divine and the material, the formless and the form. And therefore there's a tension in meaning. It's hard to interpret it because of that, how it's playing out. So I think Goethe did it by design. He put a lot of different content into it. He created something that is like a carnival, essentially, right? Where you have all the different pictures, expressions of humanity. And it's somewhat dizzying at times, but it is, I think, expressing his intent to say that this expression, the striving, the richness of it, that's the end, that's the goal. That, you know, it's not the destination, it's the journey, right? That's, it seems to me, what he's saying. And then as long as you keep on that journey, as long as you keep going, things will be well, because you always have a chance to improve. You always have a chance to, realize your errors and move upwards, drawn by the eternal feminine ideal. So that's, in my mind, how I would kind of tie it all together, is with this ideal and the desire of the content to be put into some sort of form, right? That's really what's driving this work.
Wonderful. And I will just add to that, this striving absolutely applies to reading of Faust itself. And, because every time you read it, there is more. You feel
Definitely.
that you have to do more. And you keep coming back to it, and there is more, and there is more. That's absolutely true. All right. We've got some amazing meetups coming up, folks. I can't believe it. We got tonight at 9 p.m. We've got Robert Sandusky talking about systemic design, and CJ Fernley's idea of 4 on-ramps to synergetics and comprehensivity. Tomorrow is Monday, and Maritza is going to be asking people to read poems on loyalty, but make up poems on betrayal. On Tuesday is the last of our Confucius Analects. From the following Tuesday, we are going into the art of war. Jason and Amon do a great job of translating from original Chinese into these works. So that's coming up, Art of War. On Wednesday, we are going to be talking about the imposter syndrome and improv. On Thursday, we are going to be talking about the concept of sickness in the Bible and Gospel of John. That's going to be a presentation by Gary. On Friday, we are going to look at our favorite Tao Te Ching verses. And then on Saturday, Jason is going to be doing chapter 3 and chapter 4 of Bhagavad Gita. So that's what is coming up this week. Just great meetups. Hope you show up at some of them. And thank you very much, everybody. And Phil, thank you so much. Look forward to continuing it on other great works. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Great job.